All right, I believe we're live now. Perfect. All righty. Oh, I will officially welcome everyone to our Winter Tree ID 2023. This is one of our most popular webinars, and it's awesome to see so many people that want to learn how to ID trees, which is a useful skill, not just in the winter, but these are skills you can use throughout the rest of the year as well. I have my coworker and stewardship assistant here, Cody Banks, who will be leading this presentation. And I will also be leading the in-person hikes that will be happening as a follow-up to these, because of course it's easier and more fun to ID trees when they're right in front of you. And of course, I should introduce myself. My name is Mari Pattis, and I am the programs coordinator for Shirley Heinze Land Trust. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with the organization, but if you're not, we are a local environmental nonprofit that preserves land all across northwestern Indiana in 6 counties now. So we're reaching very far. And part of our mission, part of our work is to preserve and restore the land, which is what our stewardship team does. So almost 3,000 acres of land to restore. So there's a lot of acreage out there. But in your own backyard, it's kind of nice to know like what's growing, and maybe you're doing your own management at home. So without further ado, actually, before we get started, kick us off with a little joke. How can you identify a dogwood tree? Hey, I see Cody just face palming already. By its bark. And now that now that's my time. So I will hand it off to Cody. Thank you, everyone. And again, if you have any questions or anything, I will be moderating the chat, and feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. So thank you.
Well, what a tough act to follow. An absolutely amazing joke to start us off. So it looks like a lot of people are filing in. Do we want to give it a few extra minutes for people to make their way in, or should we just get started?
We can. I will fill in this time just going over those in-person tree ID hikes. We'll be showing the dates and everything for them at the end, as well as some other upcoming events. But again, just as a reminder, if you didn't see in the email or on our website, following this, we'll be having in-person hikes at Meadowbrook, Barker Woods, and at Leidig, taking you on the trails again in the winter, and doing some tree IDs then. We also have some volunteer training opportunities that are coming up. So if you want to take these skills and use them in the field, or just learn more about our other restoration work that we're doing, please join us for those. Do we have any questions from the audience? Excuse me, any questions so far? Alrighty. Well, we are 5 minutes over, and I'm sure I'm getting emails about people who need a Zoom link. So I think, Cody, we're good to go. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared out later. So if you missed the first few minutes or want to share with all your friends, that will be available after the presentation.
Sounds good. We can kick this off. So as Mari said, my name is Cody Banks. I am a stewardship assistant here at Shirley Heinze Land Trust. The people in stewardship do essentially everything out in the field, from taking care of the preserves for invasive species to maintaining the trails and essentially everything else in between. And every once in a while I get to lead a webinar too, to switch things up a little bit. So we're here, I'm at home. I brought a little Mari muted me.
My bad.
That's all right. So here we go. Is this presenting correctly for everybody? Can everybody see everything? Yes. Okay. Yes. So during this webinar today, we're going to learn a handful of important and interesting things. Very interesting to me, at least. We're going to talk about first what defines a tree and why you should care about them. And then we're going to talk about parts of a tree that you can use to identify them in the winter. And then at the very end, we're going to kind of wrap all those things together to talk about how to use a dichotomous key. If you don't know what a dichotomous key is, that's totally fine. We'll get to that at the end of the presentation. You can just enjoy the ride up until that point. So for the beginning, I always think it's important to talk about why trees are important and why you should care about them and why you should be interested in being able to identify them. I obviously work out in the field. I do a lot of ecological restoration and management work. So it's important for me to be able to assess a habitat based on the types of plants and everything else that are living within it. But that can apply to essentially everybody else as well, whether you're out in your backyard or out on a nature hike on one of our preserves. Most habitat types are defined by either the number of trees that they have, the species of trees that they have, or even the lack of trees that they have. So a forest is only a forest for the trees. A savanna, which is a habitat that we have in our region, is specifically a less densely wooded area. And then things like prairies are prairies only because they are not covered in trees. So trees really make or break the habitat type, depending on what you're looking at. So this is a whole can of worms that I find very interesting that I'll try not to dwell on for far too long. For the purposes of what we're talking about today, I think it's important to define a tree so we're all kind of on the same page, which sounds silly. Everyone knows what a tree is, right? So everything that is a tree is made out of wood. The woody part of the tree is what survives above ground during the winter, even if the leaves fall away and everything else of it dies back. And then the rest of these bullet points essentially separate trees out from shrubs. So a tree has to be above 20 feet tall, which is a very gray area for a million different reasons. You can obviously have young trees that are not 20 feet tall. That's just a baby tree. You can also have shrubs that get really big in certain circumstances, so they might top 20 feet, does not necessarily make them a tree. Similarly, trees have to be at least 3 inches in diameter. We measure tree width in diameter at breast height, or DBH. They make special measuring tapes just to wrap around trees, so you don't have to do the math to convert from circumference to diameter. But a tree is only a tree if it's made of wood, over 20 feet tall, and its trunk is at least 3 inches across. They need to be mostly unbranching for the first several feet off the ground, which is obviously another very vague, generalized idea. But if you think about it, a shrub could be branching from the very bottom and make up kind of a big round shape. A tree, by definition, needs to have some unbranching portion near the bottom. And then, as this last bullet point says, you have to have some sort of defined crown on top. We have many shrub species that might get more than 20 feet tall, but don't have a single, mostly unbranching trunk for the first several feet off the ground, things like that. That all being said, the definition of a tree is very constructed and sort of made up. It's not some sort of taxonomical group. Not all things that are trees are necessarily closely related to one another. There are trees like the black locust, an invasive tree in our area, that is in the Fabaceae family with the peas. So they're nitrogen fixers. They're more related to soybeans than they are to something like oaks. I also fell down an entire rabbit hole this morning trying to figure out whether or not palm trees count as trees. They don't live around here, so I'm not super familiar, but they don't. They're their whole nother group of things, even though they seem like they fit most of these patterns. So from there, we're going to talk about the specific things that we'll use to identify trees. It's worth noting here at the beginning, just to set expectations, that this will not be a presentation of slide 1 being oaks, slide 2 being maples, things like that. There are simply too many trees for me to reasonably go through in an hour or so and give you guys any sort of useful information about all of them. So what we're going to do instead is give information about the characteristics of the tree that you'll use to identify them using a dichotomous key, which is an identification tool that we'll talk about at the end. So we're going to talk about twigs and the various structures on them that are really important. This first set of bullet points here is the most important part and probably the biggest takeaway of this entire thing. Beyond that, you've got bark, fruit. Sometimes you can have leaves. Some woody plants have a very particular smell, which can help. And then we'll talk about habitat really briefly at the end, but that's a little more of an end game, different thing to learn. You need some more ecological background there. I always think it's funny. I will lead classes and hikes like this, and people will come up to me with a picture on their cell phone and say, this tree is in my yard. I took a picture of only the bark. Can you tell me what it is? And it's just brown. Bark is one of those things that people think is very useful a lot of the time for winter tree identification. And I'll talk about a few species where that is certainly the case. But if you've looked at a tree, a lot of them are just brown at the bark. So we'll talk about that, but these first sets of bullet points are definitely the most important. We'll talk about first the structures on the twig. So bud arrangement is really important. Not to pretend that you guys don't know what a twig is, but we'll talk about this first. You have the twig here in this photo. Can everybody see my cursor? I'm over here pointing with my cursor and I don't even know.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So you have the twig here and other smaller twigs coming off of it. At the tip of the twig, you've got a terminal bud, and we'll talk more about all of those sorts of things here at the end or in the next few slides. You can also have lateral buds, which will be off to the sides. Buds, leaf scars, and twigs follow one of three options for arrangement on the twig. The first one we're going to talk about here is opposite. So in this example here, you can see you have two twigs coming off of the same point on this twig that they're branching out of. I brought an example, if anybody can see it. I was told this is a coffee plant, obviously not native to the region, but as you can see, the leaves are branching, two of them coming off of the same spot on the twig. So that might be a good example. This is a very helpful character for people to learn, especially I think it's a very helpful one to learn first, because even if you're looking at a big tree that you can't necessarily get to the buds on to take a good look at up close, you can at least most of the time see this branching pattern from the ground looking up into the canopy. So that is useful in circumstances like this where you have opposite branching. In our area, and obviously this doesn't apply everywhere in the world, most of the woody plants with opposite branching fall into this madcap horse acronym that people use, which stands for the maples, ashes, dogwoods, Caprifoliaceae, which is a family of mostly woody shrubs, and horse chestnuts. If you're looking at something woody in our region with opposite branching pattern, it's almost certainly one of these things. So you're narrowing it down very significantly, very early on, which can be a really big help if you're a little overwhelmed by your options as to what you might be looking at. And we'll talk about the other branching patterns later, but this is a very easy group to help narrow it down. So by far the most common branching and bud pattern that you'll see is called alternate. This one is just one bud or one leaf scar or one twig alternating back and forth on the twig. I wish that I could give you a fun acronym. If it's not opposite, it's pretty much everything else, which I know isn't super helpful, but if you are looking at something opposite, you can narrow it down significantly. There's not a whole lot more to say about this. Obviously, it applies to a ton of trees in our region. The smallest group, which you don't really run into a whole lot, are the world bud arrangements. This is essentially opposite, except you've got 3 or more coming out of the same spot on the twig. This is a catalpa, which is not native right here in our region, but it is native farther south. You see a lot of these growing along riverbanks and planted in some areas. This is obviously not catalpa in the winter, but it's very hard to convey this sort of 3-sided branching pattern without the leaves on it. So as you can see from this point here, you've got the stems of 3 different leaves coming off of the same point. This really, if you're looking at a tree, something tree-sized growing here in its world, I'd bet my money that it's a catalpa, also called a cigar tree. We do have buttonbush that grows in a lot of our wetlands around here. Obviously not a tree, would not be nearly the size of a catalpa. We will talk more specifically about buds here. I feel like this is a good example to kind of convey what the buds are and what they're doing. A bud is a very special structure, most of the time covered in scales, that helps protect very tender tissues, young leaf tissues, the tips of the stems that will continue to grow out. They have to manage to keep those alive and safe during the winter. And the way that most things do that is to cover them in these little scales. Not all buds have scales on them. Almost everything that I say in this presentation will be some form of generalization. But as you can see, this is what happens to the bud in the spring when things warm up, or maybe this year in mid-January. We'll see what happens. When the weather warms up and the tree thinks that it's spring, these buds will start to swell and elongate like this. The scales will get bigger for a while and eventually start to peel away. And then in this last shot, you can really see these new tiny leaves poking out, as well as the very tip of the stem, which will continue to grow out for the rest of the season. A lot of people assume that these buds grow in the winter. They show up in the winter or very late fall. The tree will grow these during the growing season in preparation for the winter. So when it's in the growing season and it's sunny and they have ample nutrients and warmth and things like that, they'll put the energy into making next year's buds so that they have them locked and loaded, ready to go for winter time to keep everything safe. We're going to take a close look here at a couple of different buds. This is from an American beech, Fagus grandifolia. They have these very distinct, long, people normally say cigar-shaped buds that they grow for the winter. You need to learn the difference between terminal buds, which are exactly what they sound like. They're at the very tip, the end of the branch, or lateral buds, like this one off to the right. But probably most important for identifying individual species are looking at the scales of the bud. The zoomed in picture hopefully shows pretty well what I'm talking about. I picked this species because they have very large and easy to see buds and scales. The scales are complicated, modified leaf structures that survive the winter and help keep everything safe. When you're looking at a bud and its scales for the purposes of identifying it in the winter when you don't have access to leaves, you'll be looking at way more characteristics about it than you could possibly imagine. Obviously, there's number and size and color and things like that. But as you look at more and more of these and learn about them, everything down to the texture, whether or not they're fuzzy, do they have a little mustache of hairs, the list goes on and on. To the point that someday you'll get so interested in it that you'll be holding a little magnifying glass trying to count the number of scales on a bud. These are obviously super variable. And we'll see a couple more examples as well as we go. It's worth noting, at least briefly, that in some species, it's really easy to tell the difference between leaf buds, like these. Leaf buds are, and of course I'm generalizing, typically smaller, slender, as compared to flower buds. Certain species will have very different types of buds, and that can be a really helpful diagnostic character when you're trying to identify the tree that you're looking at. Along with buds, there are leaf scars, which are another very important twig character that we'll look at. I have this example here. The leaf scar on a twig is where last year's leaf was physically attached to it. So as you can imagine, in the fall, when the tree is shedding its leaves, there's a spot where the base of that leaf was stuck to the twig. So as a result, the shape of the base of the leaf where it's attached leaves a very specific shape behind when it breaks off. This one is very shield shaped. Inside of most leaf scars, you'll see bundled scars. So this sort of outer perimeter that I've highlighted is the edge of where that leaf was stuck onto the twig. Inside of that scar, these dark spots, which I think look a lot like a smiley face, which is why I picked it for this example. These are the spots where the vascular tissue, the tissue that moves fluid and nutrients through the branch and into the leaf and vice versa. This is the points where they connect. So the leaf essentially had something like veins that would attach here to sort of swap water and nutrients back and forth with the rest of the plant. These, in some species with big leaf scars, are really easy to see. Sometimes the bundled scars are very prominent, very dark, or very differently colored from the rest of the twig. When you're looking at things like that, there's obviously a ton of variability. You're looking mostly for the size of the leaf scar, the shape of the leaf scar, and then the number and arrangement of these bundled scars. So you can have leaf scars that are very small, and in those cases, you normally don't see the bundled scars all that well, just because you're looking for such a small structure. In bigger leaf scars, they're normally pretty prominent, the bundled scars, but they can come in a lot of different shapes and orientations. There's ones like this that look like little smiley faces. There's ones with many that are arranged in almost a circle. They come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And then, of course, here is our lateral bud on this twig. Very different looking from the American beech that I showed. So this one is pretty stout, kind of round. And if you can make it out, it's not just the blurry photo that I took. The bud itself is very lightly fuzzy. I try my best to point out to people when we're talking about things like this that you can draw parallels between a lot of these things. So obviously a tree with a very big, heavy leaf that acts like a sail in the wind needs a lot of area to hold that leaf down during the growing season. So a tree with very small leaves might have very small leaf scars just because it physically doesn't take that much force to hold on to them. But something like in this left set of photos, my favorite tree in the region, the Kentucky coffee tree, this entire structure in this bottom picture is a single leaf. It's a compound leaf. This structure can be 2.5, 3 feet long. They're very, very big. So as a result, the leaf scars, which are shown in this top photo, are also very large, just because that the anchoring force that you need to hold on to it is very, very large. This is a contentious topic amongst some of my colleagues. Pith is a typically kind of soft, spongy tissue that is in the very middle of the twig. This is a contentious topic for identification because I don't want anybody from this webinar to go, Cody from the webinar told me I should go to Shirley Heinze Land Trust nature preserves and cut all of the available twigs off of all of the branches that I can reach by the trail. Please don't do that. You normally don't have to cut a twig apart to identify it. But I do think it's worth noting because we have a couple interesting species that there is a little bit of variability in pith structure like this. So on the left, you have solid pith, which is exactly what it sounds like, just one continuous texture all the way through. In the middle is diaphragmed pith, which you don't see very much at all. This is a solid pith with these little bands going through it. This, off the top of my head, I always associate with black gum. This is sylvatica, has pith like this. And then on the right, this is a chambered pith. Obviously, it's not solid all the way through. You have the same diaphragms that you do in this middle picture, but there's no soft, spongy pith in the middle of them. So these are essentially just air-filled pockets inside of the twig. Again, please don't cut off all of the twigs that you can reach on the trail. Next up, and as we go farther down the list and we get farther away from buds and leaf scars and things like that, these are sort of more niche characters that don't necessarily apply to everything, but can be really helpful in specific circumstances. So fruits and seeds in the winter obviously don't apply to everything, but there are shrubs and trees that, especially in a mostly snowless winter like we're having right now, you can either find these on the ground or sometimes they're still hanging from the twigs. So acorns obviously are associated with the oaks, and it's not exactly my specialty, but you can identify a lot of oaks specifically just by the acorns and their shape and the caps and things like that. Beyond that, you have things like walnuts and hickories. So on this, in the right picture is a hickory nut, the husks. If you have a hickory in your yard, you probably know it because these husks are absolutely everywhere and they make a massive mess. The squirrels really like them and then they just scatter them everywhere. In the bottom left is a winterberry, not a tree, a shrub, but it will hold on to these berries for a pretty considerable portion of the winter, waiting for birds to come and get them. So these are just three examples, of course, but sometimes things like hawthorns or crab apples might be holding on to those fruits later in the winter, which can help with identification, but they're obviously not always available. In a more normal January, if you have a couple of feet of snow on the ground, you might not be able to find the acorns laying around. So I normally try not to rely on this for the most part, but it is very helpful if you can get to these. Getting into even more niche and specialty things is smell. When it's bone cold and very dry outside, it can be really hard to smell some of these things sometimes, but there are a few that are very strongly scented. On the left, you have a sassafras. If anybody has ever handed you a broken or cut sassafras branch, you know what it smells like. It smells, to me at least, exactly like lemon pledge. It's such a strong smell that you can smell it in the winter. I see at least one shrug in the video in the bottom. So maybe someone disagrees with my lemon pledge assessment, but I think it's pretty apt. On the right, you have a tree of heaven, which is a terrible invasive in our region, really fast growing. Very characteristic and easy to identify for a lot of different reasons, but aside from the very thick, very stout branches and the huge leaf scars and all of these bundled scars, they smell just generally terrible. So not only are they invasive, not only are they taking over a lot of areas that we don't want them to be in, when you have the pleasure of cutting them down and dealing with them, they smell absolutely rancid. I don't really have a good analogy for this one. I'm not as confident as I am about the lemon pledge, but sort of like dirty, rotten socks. They're really terrible. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everything. You'll learn through people or through books that every once in a while there's something you can ID through smell, but it doesn't really apply a ton. Back to bark, which again, everybody comes and they go, hey, I have this tree, the bark is brown, it's kind of rough. Do you know what kind of tree that is? Unless it's a very distinct and very unique type of bark, I try to avoid it as best I can for winter tree ID. Bark can look really different if it's wet or dry, different lighting conditions, different ages of a tree can look extremely different. So I try to kind of avoid that as best as I can. On the left is my second favorite tree. This is a sycamore. This is a tree that from a mile away, you can identify these. Grow very large, they're very stately, very pretty trees. The bark, as you can see, is real thin, kind of papery, and it peels off and leaves these really nice rounded patterns on the tree. They, as those layers peel off, the tree turns more and more of this really striking white color. So this is a really easy one to identify. Even if you can't get to the buds, if you can't see the branching pattern, things like that, this is a really nice and easy one. In the middle is a shagbark hickory, very aptly named for its very shaggy bark. This is one that when it's big, when it's old, it's very easy to ID. The bark will slough off in these really long, very noticeable and obvious shaggy patterns. That being said, when they're young, they look completely different. So you can't always go off of this. And then on the right, again, is an American beech with characteristic buds and very easy to identify bark. These are also called, I've heard people call them signature trees. These are the ones that love-struck teenagers will carve their names in with a heart around it. Again, please don't do that. That's terrible, very bad for the tree. But for the same reasons that people carve their names in it, it's a very easy to identify tree, even at a distance, because it's this mostly smooth, very gray bark. So I feel like these three give a really good mix of different types and colors and textures of bark that you would see. But I chose these three very specifically because they're easy to identify by their bark. If you come to one of the hikes that I'm leading or that Doug is leading, we can talk about bark more specifically in person, but it's one of those things that's a little harder to convey via picture. And then I want to talk about habitat. Habitat is obviously something that you need to have a little more understanding of what you're looking at to give you a good hint as to what tree you might be around. There are obviously species of plants, trees included, that grow in very wet habitats and not very dry habitats. You wouldn't expect to find something like a cattail growing at the top of a bone dry sandy dune, right? This applies to a lot of trees. Superficially, these two species look kind of similar. And I have the chat pulled up. Does anyone have a guess as to what these trees are? Throwing everybody on the spot very quickly.
You can unmute if you want to shut out the answer.
Oh, that works too.
You
Is it
takers
a
or
jack pine?
Juniper?
There, I heard jack pine there. Oh, I'm going backwards, or I'm going forwards. So there is a jack pine here. on the right. Jack pine is a species that's associated very heavily with our more duneland regions. They grow pretty dry. They're up by the lake, that sort of thing. Anyone have the left one? They're a very cool tree. There's not a lot of them around, so people don't see them a whole lot.
Juniper?
No, good guess. Yeah, this is a tamarack. So tamaracks will grow in very wet, typically like boggy type habitats. So even though superficially these are both needled trees, they're both similar colors, things like that. If you're standing knee deep in the mud, you're probably not looking at a jack pine. That's a sort of thing that as you do more botanical stuff, as you identify more trees and more plants in general, you kind of get a feel for things like that. This sort of habitat assessment is also really useful because you can go from the top down. So you can start with trees. You can learn if you know the tree, you might be able to assess the habitat that you're standing in based on the trees. And then from there, you can take a good educated guess as to what other species you might see around it, whether that be other trees that you can identify in the winter with a little help and educated guess, or during the growing season, there's in some habitats very strong associations between different species. So this sort of thing can be really helpful, but not necessarily in every single case. Leaves in the winter, obviously not super helpful in a lot of cases. The evergreens, so like the pines and things like that, the needles are the leaves. So they are holding on to those during the winter. You can identify based on needle shape, the number of needles in a cluster, things like that. But there are things like this beech tree. This is a young one. You can see those really long, skinny buds. But even if you were too far away to see something like that, and this tree is too small to get that characteristic bark that you'd see at a distance, beeches, when they're young, for one reason or another, seem to hold on to their leaves for a really long time through the winter. So in certain forested habitats, you'll have otherwise completely bare and empty trees, and then a sort of smattering of these baby beech trees poking out through certain areas as well. Again, in the same case as having fruits or nuts available or things like that, in a winter like this where you might not have snow the entire time, you can kind of cheat and look at the ground in some circumstances. And if you think you're looking at an oak and you find oak leaves on the ground, that can kind of help to assert that maybe you're looking at what you think you're looking at. Oh, and Doug in the chat says, and tamaracks have beautiful golden fall color, which is also true. So all of those things considered, how do you apply them? So you've listened to me tell you about buds and leaf scars and twig arrangements, environment, all sorts of things like that. Like I said at the beginning, what we can't easily do in a class like this is give you every sort of tree that you might run into in the region. You can take skills like this and use a dichotomous key. Books like, I learned a lot of this through 101 Trees of Indiana when I was in college. There are a lot of other resources. Doug, our staff ecologist who's here, has made a winter tree identification key specifically for trees in our region, which is going to be a huge help. That being said, every key is kind of set up differently. They all work generally in the same way, but you have a lot of options for things to use. And I believe after this presentation, we'll be sending everybody a list of resources that you can use to help you with identification with stuff like these. I have an example, or I have a couple example dichotomous keys that we'll go through so that they make good sense. That being said, dichotomous keys are very useful, especially when you get used to them and you know the terminology. Anyone that's seen a copy of Flora of the Chicago region, which is a giant book that has all of our vascular plants in the Chicago region, that book is full of very complicated dichotomous keys. And when I'm using them, I'm in the glossary more often than not, trying to understand new words. I think the easiest way, especially when you're getting started, is to just find a buddy that can help, or come on a hike like the ones that Doug and I are leading in the next week or so. Being in person with somebody who knows the tree saves you a lot of time, especially in the winter when you're cold and you don't want to stand out there with a book and a magnifying glass trying to look at every little character, trying to identify your tree. Keys can be really slow, especially if you don't know the words that you're looking at, but a buddy can help. And as you get more momentum, for lack of a better word, as you start to learn, you can narrow things down into families or groups a little more easily at the beginning. So instead of running through a key from the very top, you might be able to look at something and go, oh, I know that is an oak tree, but I don't know which one. So you can skip to that part, and that'll save you a lot of time as well. So I've made a very simple key to get us started. And I'm sorry for those that know what a dichotomous key is and are about to watch me identify whatever this creature is in the bottom right. But for those that have not used a key before, you're looking at couplets. So in this example, we're trying to identify one of these 5 animals. You start with couplet 1. Sometimes these are labeled something like 1A or 1A and 1B to kind of make things easier to look at. But you would start with couplet 1. So we'll identify this little guy on the right. I have no idea what this is. I've never seen one before. I have to use a dichotomous key to figure it out. So couplet 1 reads, animals with scales or animals without scales. No scales. So we'll go down to this next couplet. Hopefully that, if anybody isn't following, I have chat open and we can parse through it a little more. But since this animal does not have scales, we'll go down to this couplet. Number 3 says with short ears or with long ears. I would say this guy's got long ears. So instead of going down this path, which would lead you to these 2 options, you go down here with long ears. We're looking at a rabbit, which I have not seen before. So this is obviously a really simple one. This is very condensed. If you have 100 species, 1,000 species, the keys obviously get a lot more complicated and need to get into more specific things. But this is a good intro course. So to get a little more specific, I believe I have not divulged what this tree is, even though I've used it in other slides so far. This is another fairly simple key that I found online that we'll use to go through. This is not the one that Doug has made. We will include that one, and I can switch screens here in a minute and we'll look at his as well because it's set up a little bit differently. So looking at this twig here on the right, your first couplet reads, leaves persistent and green throughout the winter, needle-shaped, all-shaped, or scaly, or leaves deciduous, not remaining on the trees through winter. And I'm not going to ask everybody to unmute. Go the second one, but I think that since this one doesn't have trees, we'll go through the second path here. So couplet 2 reads, twigs with lateral wart-like branches, slender, glossy brown, resinous, or twigs lacking lateral wart-like branches. If you've never seen a twig with lateral wart-like branches, you would not be alone. So at this point, if this were a specific couplet that got confusing and you weren't sure what you were looking for, this is easy because this first one is going directly to a species. So you could look that one up look at some pictures and realize that that's not the one you're looking at. We don't have little wart-like branches on this twig. So we're going to couplet 3. Leaf scars and branches and buds are opposite or alternate. That's the first set of characteristics that we went through a while ago. You can see these little lateral buds here don't have a corresponding one directly across from it, so it's not opposite. So we'll be going with alternate, which is this bottom couplet, and I couldn't fit the entire thing on one screen, so we'll have to jump here. This couplet goes to set 8, which is was also too long for me to fit the entire thing on one screen. But couplet 8, the first option would be terminal bud present, either surrounded by a cluster of buds or borne singly. We talked about that as well. So we've got lateral buds and terminal buds. So this terminal bud here is at the end. Sorry, I'm moving chat and everything around so I can also see the pictures. But let's see, terminal bud surrounded by a cluster of buds at the end of the twig, fruit and acorn. We obviously don't have the fruit here, but oaks very characteristically have a whole cluster of little buds at the end of the twig, which we don't have here. So this is born singly. You've got just one big bud at the end. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay. Buds with 3 to 4. Sorry. Buds with 3 to 4 dark brown, smooth outer scales spreading away from the bud, bark peeling in long strips like that shag bark that we looked at earlier. That is not the case. That's not what we're looking at. Looking at buds variously colored with various number of scales, flattened against a twig or spreading, bark usually tight, not peeling. Couplet 26, buds covered with close-fitting woolly scales or bud scaled smooth, not woolly. I used this twig in an example in a different one. So as you can see in this picture, it's very fuzzy. They look kind of like felt. So we'll go with this first one. Twigs with chambered pith. This is that chambered pith that I also used in that picture. So right, you've got these little cross sections going across with these empty sections in the middle. So we'll go with that first set. And then I'm a little colorblind, so these are always difficult for me. Pith cream colored, twigs lacking a mustache of hair beneath the bud, or pith chocolate colored, twigs with mustache of hair. I don't know. Can somebody confirm if this is cream colored? I don't think this is particularly the color of cream. But if we go back, there is not a little, like a little mustache of hair under these buds. So when people set up these keys, you normally try to include multiple defining characters. So even if one of them is a little difficult to spot, you can use the other ones. So given that, I did get one yes in the chat. We're lacking that little mustache of hairs. We'll go with black walnut. So I know that that's kind of a dull thing sometimes to watch people go through in a live stream at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, but it's very interesting, or it's very useful, at least, if you've never used them before, for someone to run through a key with you. Like I said, there's a lot of options to look at for these, and we'll send you all Doug's key, which will be very useful. I would like to actually look at that. Can everybody see this? Yes, wonderful. So Doug's key is set up a little bit differently. I like the way that this is set up. It's broken into groups at first. So you'll notice that this first bullet is a 1, and then you switch into letters. So Group 1, as he set up this key, is trees with green leaves present. And as you can see, they go into the pines and the cedars and things like that. If you scroll down, then you have group 2, buds and leaves opposite or whorled. And then group 3 has thorns or spines. Group 4, and so on from there. So this lets you break it down into smaller sections very quickly rather than running through one really long, cumbersome key. But as a very quick run through, that tree that we looked at, that walnut, doesn't have green leaves right now. The buds were alternate, not opposite. There were no thorns, so we'll go to 4. 4 is terminal buds clustered like the oaks. This picture kind of shows everything that I was trying to say earlier. That's not the case. So 5 is these big leaf scars, and he's gone through the trouble of adding some really good example photos as well. So that leaf scar that we were looking at is really big and badge or horseshoe shape. So then you would go down here, couplet A starts on this line, and then the second part of the couplet is down here. So instead of having every single tree that he's tried to add into one really long dichotomous key, it's been broken down into short sections. So now you just have this page or so rather than the entire thing being one really long key to run through. So just before 7 gives us a chance for Mari to step in, and we'll talk about these upcoming hikes and some other programs and things like that. And then we've got time set aside specifically for questions. So we have some people in the chats that will kind of feed questions out to me. So if you have something that you'd like to ask, we've got plenty of time to go through and talk about it.
Right. Well, thank you, Cody. And just as a reminder, I know we kind of threw out some like new terminology and some like, you know, maybe like scary sounding words, but again, it's just things like the dichotomous key are just a way for you to identify traits of a plant and then narrow down your choices from there. And I think Cody and Doug both did a good job of breaking these down so they are easier to understand. But again, this is your time to ask questions, both on Facebook and in the Zoom chat, and we will answer them in the meantime. But speaking of, or to follow up these, we have quite a handful of winter tree ID hikes that will be led by Cody and Doug. And you can register for them on our website, heinzetrust.org/events. And these are limited spaces just because it is easier to learn when there's a smaller group. So if you want to save your spot, do so now. And you'll learn a lot and kind of build upon what you've learned at this webinar.
Hey, Mari, I have a quick question for the hike number 4. When it put it on the calendar, it put it at 11 a.m., I think, Eastern. So I just wanted to make sure that 10 a.m. was the correct time for that one.
Oh, yeah. I think our website is like defaults to Central Time. So as long as it's in the correct Eastern time, which should be indicated in the description, the text description. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the balance of having to work in two time zones. So, and then Cody, you can move on to the next slide. So we have even more events coming up. We have a variety of webinars that happen throughout the year. One of which is our Farmland Legacy, highlighting unique farmland preservation stories. So our ag program is a relatively new program, and we're just working our way towards sustainable farming and getting those resources out to farmers. So if you want to learn more about that, that webinar will be happening February 23rd. Similar format to this, we'll be sending out a Zoom link, and we'll start at 6 o'clock Central Time. We'll have our project manager, Alicia Pellegrino, on board, as well as some other stewardship staff who will be leading that. And should be a good time. We'll have some partners also speaking there. So if you want to learn more about that, our registrations are wide open for that. We also have some in-person events coming up. We are kicking off some more monthly programming, so you can expect to see that at Meadowbrook and Leidick if you enjoy getting out and hiking, and one of which is in partnership with the South Bend Elkhart Audubon Society. And that will be February 18th. That entire weekend is actually the Great Backyard Bird Count. So if you can't make it to this event, if you upload your observations to the, I believe it's the eBird app, these observations will be used to help scientists figure out where birds are at this time of year. So again, that's happening at Leidick Bog if you want to join some other fellow birders or want to get into birding. That will be at Leidick Bog Saturday, February 18th at 8:30. We also have a robust volunteer program. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of acreage, and even though our stewardship staff covers a lot of ground, we can't be everywhere all at once. So our volunteers kind of help fill in those gaps where we need it most. So we have Meadowbrook Mondays every month, every first and third Monday. You don't need any prior experience or anything. You can just come and learn about our restoration work and then get to participate yourself. And we also have some trainings coming up. So if you want to become a more regular volunteer and adopt a trail and hike our trails once a month to report back to us, or become a hike leader, we'll be talking about our general volunteer opportunities January 25th. We'll be having our adopted child training on February 15th. It's not on this list, but the volunteer naturalist training to become a hike leader is February 21st. And to add on to our list, we are also launching a water quality monitoring volunteer program, and that training will be happening March 25th. Again, a lot of trainings happening, and feel free to attend all of them or none. But again, it's another great way to support the organization if you have the time. And finally, our biggest event of the year is our annual spring benefit. Will be held at the Urshel Pavilion this year. Similar format as last year if you were there. It should be a great time. And again, it's our biggest event of the year. So any way you can support us in that for that event, that would be amazing. So I just rambled on a lot about upcoming programs, and I don't see any tree questions yet. But does anyone, again, the floor is open if anyone has questions or comments. Where do the trainings take place? Most of these, I believe, are at Meadowbrook Nature Preserve itself. The water quality one might be on Zoom, but everything is indicated on the website. So I think during the pandemic, a lot of our volunteer trainings were on Zoom, but we're trying to get back more in person because it's just kind of easier to teach those concepts when you can all be in the same room and maybe even get a little hike out of it too. I know people are heading out, so as people are heading out, thank you for tuning in today. And Cody, what's on that next slide? Well, I'll leave this here. It's the good thing to, if you're not already either on our email list or staying up to date on our events via Facebook, that's a great way to find out more about these upcoming events as they come up. Again, this is just the first quarter of the year, and in the summer we'll be having programs left and right. We'll have our Nature and the Arts program again this year, and programs all around our 20+ nature preserves. So come and hike with us. And if you're watching on Facebook, before you head out, don't forget to share and like this video. We will be sharing this webinar as well as the wonderful tree ID key that Doug made, and a list of those books that Cody was talking about. And again, if you have any questions or want to know more about this, you can call or email our office, and we're happy to help. All right, you guys are so smart. You just absorbed all that information, so. Alrighty, Cody, Doug, any other last comments or anything? Otherwise, I think we can let people go.
No, I feel like that covers everything pretty well. I hope to see people out on the hikes. I'd like for them to be full, ideally. Makes me feel like people are interested in learning about trees. but a lot of these things will be very applicable, things that we talked about. We will use Doug's key. You'll be able to see things in person, hold the twigs, see everything up close that we've been talking about, which makes things, I think, a lot easier to absorb.
All right. Well, again, thank you, everyone. We're getting out a little bit early today, so enjoy your extra 28 minutes of time, and we'll see you at the next webinar or on the next hike. All righty. Bye, everyone.